Now, as an old man, I tell this story calmly. I have learned silence and truth speak louder than anger. My son threw away my things, but the real lesson was about respect. I learned that revenge is not in shouting or fighting. It is in showing the truth with quiet strength. When they saw my brother, they understood what they had lost. Respect is priceless, and it cannot be bought. I spent decades working hard to give my family comfort and safety. Every morning I woke before the sun, and every night I returned home long after it had set. My hands grew rough, my back bent, and my body ached from years of labor, but I did not complain. I knew that the work I did was not just for myself. It was for the people I loved most, my family. I wanted them to live without hunger, without fear, without the cold shadow of uncertainty over their heads. I wanted them to have a home where laughter could be heard and where they could sleep without worry. That was my dream, my mission, my life's work. I saved every penny so our home would remain a place of warmth. Money never came easily. Every rupee was hard-earned. I did not spend it on myself. I wore worn-out clothes so that my children could wear better ones. I skipped meals so they could eat well. When I felt tired, I did not rest. I worked harder so they would not need to. Every extra hour I worked, every sacrifice I made, was because I wanted to build something lasting for them. It was never about riches for me. It was about security, comfort, and love. I believed a home was more than four walls. It was the foundation of a family's life. I believed respect was the foundation of family life. Respect was something I tried to teach, not with words alone, but with my life. I showed them respect by listening when they spoke. I showed them respect by giving them space to grow and decide. I respected their choices even when I feared they might go wrong. I thought respect was something that came naturally in a family where love and sacrifice lived side by side. I believed if I gave my life for them, they would honor it without hesitation. That belief shaped every action I took and every sacrifice I offered silently. I thought my children would honor my sacrifices without question. I believed they would remember the years I gave up sleep to ensure they could have their dreams. I thought they would understand the long hours I spent away from home, the meals I missed so they could have theirs, the quiet nights I endured alone so they could sleep in peace. I trusted that the foundation I built with my hands and heart would be returned with loyalty and care. This trust was not blind. It was rooted in love, in years of shared history, and in the belief that family ties are sacred. Every day I worked, I dreamed of them appreciating what I had built. I imagined their faces when they would recognize the depth of my devotion. I imagined them telling me one day, "Father, we see how much you gave for us." That thought carried me through the hardest days. Even when my body was worn out, even when the weight of the world seemed too heavy, I found strength in the hope that my family would value what I had done. That hope was my fuel, my anchor, and my light in the darkest times. I never imagined they could treat me with such disrespect. Years passed and life moved forward, but one thing remained. I gave without complaint. And yet, slowly, I began to notice a change. My sacrifices seemed invisible. My devotion became a burden in their eyes. Words of gratitude became rare, and gestures of kindness faded. I began to hear tones of impatience, laughter that carried mockery, and silence when I entered the room. It hurt more than any hardship I had faced in my life. To give and to be treated with disregard felt like the deepest wound. I gave all I had, believing love would follow. But as time went on, I realized that love alone cannot always protect respect. I had thought that years of devotion would build an unshakable bond. I had believed that my sacrifices would make my family see me as their protector, their anchor. But respect, I learned later, must be nurtured by care from both sides. Without mutual regard, even the strongest bonds can break. And that was the painful truth I had to face. This devotion was not born from obligation, but from love. I was not counting what I gave, but I was counting on the fact that my family would remember it. I was building a life for them, not for myself. I wanted them to stand strong in the world with the shelter of what I had built. Every brick of our home, every penny saved, every night I worked late, all were part of my silent promise to them, and that promise shaped my entire life. Yet, devotion without reciprocity is a lonely road. I began to feel invisible, like my life's work was taken for granted. I began to question whether years of sacrifice meant anything if those you sacrificed for could discard you so easily. That question haunted me, but I did not yet know the answer. I only knew I had given my life without regret, hoping that someday it would mean something to them. Little did I know, the events that followed would test not just my devotion, but my very dignity. They would strip away everything I thought I knew about family, respect, and the value of giving, and they would push me toward a decision that would change everything. At first, the signs were small. I noticed them only when I paused to think about how things had changed. My son, who once greeted me with warmth, began to speak sharply at home. His words lost their softness, replaced by impatience and irritation. He no longer listened when I spoke. Instead, he dismissed my opinions as outdated or unnecessary. I tried to tell myself it was a phase, that perhaps stress or life's burdens were making him short-tempered. But deep inside, I felt something else, a growing distance, a change that went deeper than words. He began to treat my belongings without care. The chair I had brought home years ago, polished and repaired with my own hands, was thrown aside without thought. The tools I had kept with pride for decades were left scattered, their order broken. Items that I had cared for as part of my life, memories and labor woven together, became objects of neglect. My things were no longer respected. They became things to mock, to disregard, as if my years of work meant nothing. It was not just possessions. His tone, his laughter, and his gestures changed. At family gatherings, he would speak in ways that stung. He would make jokes about my age, about my old clothes, about my habits. Friends and relatives would laugh, but I could see the hurt in their eyes too. I endured quietly, speaking less so as not to invite confrontation, hoping that respect would return naturally if I remained patient. I thought that silence could be a lesson in itself, a way to show strength without hostility. Even when I tried to connect, he seemed to turn away. I would speak to him about matters of the home, about memories of the past, or even about dreams for the future. But his attention would slip away. His eyes would wander, his body would turn, and his mind would seem elsewhere. It felt as though I was speaking into emptiness. The warmth that once existed between us became colder. It was replaced by a quiet apathy that hurt far more than open anger ever could. The changes were not sudden, but gradual, a slow erosion of respect. At first, I tried to tell myself it was my imagination. Perhaps I was too sensitive, too attached to the idea that my devotion would always be valued. I told myself that life had its seasons, that relationships changed with time, but the truth was undeniable. The love that had once been shown in kindness, care, and mutual respect was fading. In its place grew something sharper: neglect. I noticed this not only in his words and actions but in the way he looked at me. It was no longer the look of a son towards a father, filled with gratitude and trust. It was the look of impatience, of irritation, as if I were an obstacle to his life rather than a part of it. Even small things became tests of endurance. If I tried to ask for help, his response would be a sigh or a roll of the eyes. If I expressed a wish or opinion, it would be dismissed without thought. The warmth I had given freely was met with cold indifference. This change cut deep. Respect is not just about words, it is about acknowledgement, and acknowledgement had vanished. I began to feel invisible in my own home, a presence ignored rather than honored. The house that I had built with my sweat and care became a place where I felt unwelcome. Even my voice seemed to disappear when I spoke. This silence was heavier than any argument, heavier than the weight of years of labor. It was the silence of being erased. One evening, I sat quietly in my small corner of the house, thinking about all I had given. I remembered the nights I stayed awake to repair something broken for the family. I remembered the sacrifices I made to keep them warm in winter and fed in times of hardship. I thought of every meal I had skipped, every extra hour I had worked, every wound I had hidden so they could live without pain. And I asked myself, had it all been for nothing? I realized that respect, once lost, does not return by itself. It is earned every day through mutual care and understanding. But my son seemed no longer willing to give it. His behavior had crossed the line from occasional neglect to sustained disregard. I saw that he no longer saw me as a father, but as a fixture to be taken for granted. This realization filled me with a quiet sorrow. It was not anger at first, but a deep, aching grief. I also began to see how this lack of respect spread. It affected his wife, who laughed at his mockery of me. She joined in without thought, treating me as if I were an outsider in my own home. Their laughter, their shared disregard, became a chorus that echoed in my mind long after it was spoken. I endured it silently, but inside, a seed of something new began to grow, a resolve that I had not expected. I did not know then what form it would take, but I knew that I could not continue to live in silence while my dignity was stripped away. I realized that patience alone would not restore respect. Something had to change. I began to look for a way to answer not with bitterness, but with a lesson they could not ignore. A way to make them see that years of devotion cannot be discarded so easily. This was the moment when I began to understand that the true test of love is not in the sacrifices made, but in the respect that follows. A relationship without respect is not a home. It is a house without warmth. I knew then that I could no longer stand by quietly. I knew that my silence had to end. The signs of disrespect had grown too clear to ignore. They were not accidents. They were a choice, and choices must have consequences. That is why, when the breaking point came, I was ready. I was ready not to beg for respect, but to teach it in the way I knew best, with quiet determination, with the presence of truth, and with a lesson that would last far longer than words ever could. The day it happened began like any other day, but it ended with a moment I would never forget. The air was heavy, filled with tension I had learned to recognize but could not yet name. My son had been speaking sharply again, words dripping with impatience. I tried to respond quietly, to keep my voice steady, but he did not want conversation. His eyes were hard, his expression closed. Something inside him had shifted so deeply that reason no longer mattered. It began as an argument over something trivial, a chair, an old photograph, a misplaced tool. To him, it was not the object itself that mattered. It was the principle of disregarding me entirely, of showing that I had no claim to voice or value in my own home. His tone carried scorn, and his words were edged with contempt. I said nothing, but the air between us became heavier. There was no room for reconciliation in that moment. Then, without warning, he rose. His hand reached out not to speak, but to act. It was quick, sharp, an act of violence wrapped in anger. He grabbed my things without thought. A book I had treasured for decades, a photograph of my late wife, a box of keepsakes, all were hurled toward the window. The glass shook as they struck it, scattering onto the ground far below. The sound of breaking filled the air, sharp and final. I stepped forward, but before I could speak, he laughed, not softly, not with humor, but with mockery. It was a laughter that carried cruelty, and behind him, his wife joined in. Her laughter rang out loud and sharp, a chorus that turned my humiliation into spectacle. They did not see the years behind those things. They did not see the hands that had held them with care. They saw only objects to destroy, a father to demean. The impact of that moment was deeper than the noise or the breaking glass. It was the collapse of something more important, the respect that had once bound us together. It was the moment I realized that my patience had been mistaken for weakness. My silence had been mistaken for acceptance, and the love I had given without condition had been met with scorn. The laughter of my son and his wife was a sound that would haunt me. I did not respond immediately. I stood there in silence, my breath steadying as my mind worked through what had just happened. I felt the sting of betrayal sharper than any physical wound. This was not just about the things thrown away. It was about what they represented. Years of memory, years of care, years of sacrifice. To destroy them without thought was to destroy a part of me. I remembered the nights I had spent repairing that chair, polishing it until it shone. I remembered the photographs I had taken, capturing moments of love, laughter, and family. I thought of the box of keepsakes filled with letters, trinkets, and objects that told the story of my life. They were not mere possessions, they were pieces of my soul, and they had been treated as if they were worthless. The laughter of my son and his wife echoed in my ears, and I felt something shift inside me. It was not anger alone. It was a quiet resolve, a decision that this could not stand unanswered. I understood then that the breaking point had been reached. Respect, once lost, could not be quietly reclaimed. It required a response. Not a loud, vengeful one, but a deliberate one, a lesson in humility and truth. I retreated quietly into my small room, closing the door behind me. I sat alone, staring at the fragments on the ground. The broken glass glittered faintly in the fading light, a cruel reminder of what had been destroyed. I thought about what had brought us here, the slow erosion of respect, the disregard that had grown over time. This was not a moment of sudden anger. This was the result of years of neglect. I began to understand that my silence had allowed this to happen. My patience had not been a shield. It had been an invitation to disregard, and now that silence could no longer be maintained. I realized I had to make a choice, to remain a passive victim or to stand in a way that would be remembered. I chose the latter. That night, I lay awake thinking of what I would do next. I thought of my son and his wife, of their laughter, and of what it meant. I knew I could not speak to them with words alone. They would not hear them, but they would see a lesson, something undeniable, something that would not fade with time. I knew then that I would answer not with anger, but with presence. It was not a choice made in haste. I thought long into the night about how to respond. I wanted something that would make them see not just the pain they had caused, but the depth of what they had destroyed. I wanted them to understand that respect is not given lightly and that it can be taken away just as quietly as it is given. By the morning, I had made my decision. I would call my brother, not to shout or demand, but to invite him into this moment. I wanted him to witness, to stand with me, not in confrontation, but in truth. I wanted this lesson to be something that could not be denied. I wanted them to see that actions have consequences. So I picked up the phone. My voice was calm as I spoke, though inside my heart was set with resolve. I asked my brother to come, without telling him why. I wanted the meeting to be a moment of revelation, not of accusation. I wanted it to be quiet, yet powerful. I knew that this would be the turning point, not just for me, but for them as well. That breaking point was not just about the things thrown out of the window. It was about the breaking of respect, the breaking of trust, and the breaking of a bond that should never have been broken. And I knew that to repair it, or at least to answer it, required something beyond words. It required presence, truth, and a moment that could not be ignored. When my brother arrived, the stage was set. The silence that had grown between us was now filled with purpose. I was ready, not with anger, but with the quiet power of a lesson well prepared. The breaking point had come, and with it, a moment that would change everything. That night, after the noise and chaos had faded, I found myself sitting alone in my quiet room. The sound of the laughter still rang in my ears, a bitter echo that seemed to grow heavier with every passing hour. I sat in silence, staring at nothing in particular, but feeling everything all at once. The room was dimly lit, the faint glow of a single lamp casting shadows that danced across the walls. Each shadow felt like a whisper of the past, reminding me of what I had lost and what had been taken from me. I thought about the years I had spent building a home, not just of brick and mortar, but of love and care. I remembered the nights I had worked late, returning home tired but content, because I knew my family was safe. I thought of the breakfasts I had prepared, the birthdays I had celebrated, and the countless small acts of devotion that I had offered without question. These things were not grand gestures, but they were the fabric of my life, the foundation upon which I believed respect and honor were built. The act of throwing my things out the window had not been a simple act of mischief. It was a declaration. It was a statement that what I valued meant nothing to them. And worse, it was a statement that I myself meant nothing to them. I could not shake the image of my son's face as he laughed, nor the sound of his wife's voice joining him. Their laughter had stripped away the warmth of a lifetime, replacing it with a cold emptiness. I thought of pride that night, not the pride of arrogance, but the quiet pride of a life lived with purpose and dignity. That pride had been shattered, not in a moment, but over time. It had been eroded by small acts of neglect, by dismissals disguised as jokes, by the slow shift from love to disregard. I realized then that the breaking point was not sudden. It was the result of years of silence, of unspoken hurt, and of patience mistaken for weakness. As I sat there, my mind wandered to my own father. I remembered how he had taught me that respect could not be demanded, only earned. He had taught me that silence could be more powerful than words when wielded with intention. I understood then that my own silence in recent years had been a quiet offering of love, but also a test. And that test had been failed. My son and his wife had chosen mockery over compassion. They had chosen humiliation over understanding. I thought about the object lessons of life, the moments that define who we are and who we become. That night, I understood that I had reached one of those moments. I could no longer remain passive. To remain silent would be to accept the cruelty done to me. But to answer with measured action, to respond with a lesson that could not be erased, would be a way to reclaim what had been lost. Not possessions, not pride, but the dignity that comes from standing for what is right. I reflected on what kind of lesson would matter. Anger, I knew, would not teach them anything lasting. Words shouted in haste would be forgotten. What I needed was a response that was quiet, deliberate, and seen. Something that would make them understand without me needing to shout. That was the kind of strength my father had shown me, and the kind of strength I needed now. The hours passed, and the house grew quiet. The laughter of earlier had faded, but the weight of it remained. I could still feel it pressing against my chest, urging me toward a choice. I knew what I had to do. I would not confront them in anger. I would not raise my voice. I would answer with presence. I would call my brother. Not to make a scene, but to make a moment that could not be ignored. I reached for the phone with a steady hand. My voice was calm as I spoke, but inside, my mind was alive with purpose. I did not tell him why I wanted to see him. I simply said there was something important to discuss. I knew that the weight of his presence would carry its own meaning. I knew that together we could create a moment that would speak louder than any argument. Calling my brother was not about retaliation alone. It was about restoring balance. It was about showing my son and his wife that actions have consequences, and that respect is something sacred. It was about teaching them that cruelty, even when hidden behind laughter, leaves scars that do not fade quickly. I wanted them to understand that there is strength in silence and power in truth. As I hung up the phone, a sense of resolve settled over me. The room felt different now, heavier with anticipation. I was no longer just the victim of a cruel act. I was the keeper of a lesson that would be delivered. I understood that this was not just about what had happened that afternoon. It was about something larger, about family, about respect, and about the legacy we leave behind. That night, I lay awake thinking of how the next day would unfold. I pictured my son's face when he saw my brother walk through the door. I pictured the silence that would follow, the questions left unspoken, and the weight of truth pressing into the room. I knew they would not expect it, and that was exactly why it would work. Respect is not restored by words alone, but by actions that leave no doubt. By the time dawn broke, I had made my plan. I would call my brother first thing, ask him to come without explaining why. I would let the meeting happen naturally, letting them see the quiet power of truth without my having to speak it loudly. That was the lesson I wanted to give. Not a loud lecture, but a living example of dignity in the face of disrespect. As the light of morning crept into my room, I felt a strange peace. The breaking point had been reached, and the choice had been made. I would answer not with anger, but with something deeper, a lesson carried in silence, witnessed by those who needed it most. And so I lay back, feeling a quiet strength, knowing the moment was coming. That night, I learned something important. Silence, when chosen with purpose, can be louder than any argument. And respect, once lost, can be restored not by force, but by showing what it means to stand firm. I knew then that this was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a lesson that would last far longer than any shouting match could. The next morning, I woke with a sense of purpose that had been absent for many days. The laughter, the humiliation, and the sharp sting of betrayal still lingered, but they were now accompanied by clarity. The moment of reflection the night before had settled into resolve. I knew what I had to do. It was not a reaction born from anger, but a decision grounded in dignity. I would answer their cruelty, but I would do it in my own way, quietly, deliberately, and with intention. I understood that my son and his wife expected me to act with pain, perhaps even to shout, to cause a scene that would validate their cruelty. But I was determined not to give them that satisfaction. My father's voice echoed in my mind. Respect is not taken by noise. It is earned by silence that speaks volumes. That thought became my compass. My plan was to involve my brother. His presence would give weight to the lesson, and his understanding would ensure that it would not be lost in heat or argument. I picked up the phone and called my brother without hesitation. His voice greeted me warmly, but I kept my words brief. I told him there was something important I wanted to discuss, something private. I avoided giving details because the impact would depend on the surprise of the moment. My brother agreed, sensing the seriousness in my tone. We decided on a time that same afternoon in my house. I did not tell anyone else about the meeting. The secrecy was part of the plan. The moment had to be unspoiled by expectation. After the call, I sat quietly in my small living room. I could hear the faint sound of life outside, children laughing somewhere down the street, a dog barking, the hum of distant traffic. Inside, however, there was a silence heavier than any sound. I felt the gravity of what was about to unfold. This was no ordinary family disagreement. This was about honor, about respect, and about teaching a lesson that would echo for years. I thought again about my son and his wife, about their laughter, about the way they treated my possessions as if they were meaningless. It was not the things themselves that mattered. It was what they represented. Each object had a memory, a value born not of money, but of years of care and love. To throw them out the window and cheer was to throw away respect itself, and that was something I could not ignore. I realized that my decision was not only about retribution, but about reclaiming dignity. I was not seeking revenge in the petty sense. I wanted them to see, without doubt, that their actions carried consequences. I wanted them to feel the weight of what they had done without me lowering myself to mockery or anger. That was why calling my brother was essential, not as an ally for confrontation, but as a witness to truth. As I prepared for his arrival, I thought carefully about what I would say. I would not speak in anger. I would not plead or demand. I would simply introduce him and let his presence, his words, and the weight of shared history speak for themselves. My role was not to lecture, but to create a moment where truth would stand without being shouted. That was my decision, to answer disrespect with a quiet demonstration of dignity. I also knew this decision required patience. It was not something to be rushed. My son and his wife had treated me with disdain for years, and this was not a lesson that could be taught in haste. It had to be crafted. That meant waiting until the moment was right, until my brother's arrival was unexpected, and until they were unprepared for what was about to unfold. There was also a deeper lesson I wanted them to understand, that respect is earned through actions, not given freely. It is something that can be lost in an instant, but only rebuilt through humility and acknowledgement. My plan was not to humiliate them in return, but to hold a mirror to their actions so they could see themselves clearly. That was the essence of my decision. I thought about how family often loses its way when cruelty replaces care. I reflected on my own role in allowing this to happen, on the years of silence when I should have spoken sooner. But I also realized that the power to correct it lay in the choice I was about to make. I could choose to walk away silently, but that would allow the wrong to pass without challenge. Or I could choose a deliberate act that would leave a lasting impression. I chose the latter. By mid-afternoon, I was ready. I had prepared myself not just mentally, but emotionally. I knew my heart would beat faster when the moment came, but I also knew that I could remain calm. This was not about satisfying my own pride. It was about teaching a lesson that could not be erased. I wanted my son and his wife to remember this moment not for its anger, but for its truth. I sat quietly by the window, watching the light change as clouds moved across the sky. Each passing minute brought my brother's arrival closer. My thoughts wandered again to the night before, to the reflection that had led me to this decision. I thought about the importance of acting with purpose, about the strength of silence, and about the quiet dignity that comes from facing cruelty without losing yourself. When I heard the knock on the door, I felt a strange calmness. I rose slowly, adjusted my clothes, and opened the door. My brother stood there, calm and steady, with a knowing look in his eyes. Without a word, I gestured for him to enter. There was no need to explain. His presence would speak for itself. The scene was set. My decision had been made. The lesson was about to be delivered, and I knew, deep in my heart, that this was the moment when the quiet reflection of the night before would transform into a purposeful act of truth. The afternoon air was quiet, almost still, when my brother arrived at the house. There was a subtle weight to his presence, as if he understood without me saying a word that something important was about to unfold. I opened the door for him without ceremony. No introduction, no explanation, just a gesture for him to step inside. He walked in slowly, his eyes taking in the scene with a measured calmness that contrasted sharply with the tension in the house. My son was in the living room, leaning casually against the window frame, a faint smirk still lingering on his face. His wife sat nearby, her laughter having faded into curious glances. They had no idea what was coming. They thought my silence after the earlier incident meant defeat, resignation. But they were wrong. The moment I invited my brother in was the turning point. The air shifted. Their laughter was replaced by a subtle unease. They sensed something was different, but they did not know what. My brother's eyes met mine with quiet understanding. He did not ask questions. There was no need. He had known me long enough to understand that this was not a casual meeting. His presence was part of the plan, and his timing was deliberate. I motioned for him to sit. The atmosphere grew heavier with silence. My son's smirk faded, replaced by a glance of suspicion. My daughter-in-law's curiosity deepened. They did not speak, as if unsure what to say. My brother did not speak immediately either. He stood for a moment at the threshold of the room, taking in the scattered remains of the things my son had thrown out earlier. Fragments of broken possessions lying in silent accusation on the floor. The sight seemed to hold him in quiet thought. Then he took a seat with measured composure, his hands resting calmly on his knees. His presence was deliberate, quiet, but undeniably powerful. The silence was long. I could feel the tension in the air thickening, as if the room itself held its breath. My son shifted uncomfortably. His eyes darted between me and my brother, trying to understand what was happening. He had never seen my brother this way. My brother was always calm, reserved, and dignified. But now there was an added weight to him, a quiet authority that made even my son falter. I could see my son's wife leaning forward, curiosity giving way to a subtle discomfort. She had laughed at my humiliation earlier, but now she was silent, her expression uncertain. She watched my brother closely, sensing that something important was about to be revealed. My son, on the other hand, seemed defensive, as if bracing himself for a confrontation. But he did not speak. The room was filled with a quiet intensity, and the unspoken words between us carried more weight than any argument could. Finally, I broke the silence. I gestured toward my brother. "This is my brother," I said simply. No elaboration. My words were not sharp. They were calm, deliberate. My son frowned slightly, unsure what to make of this introduction. My daughter-in-law shifted in her seat. My brother nodded once, acknowledging the moment without speaking. It was enough. The silence between us had already said more than words could convey. My brother then began to speak, not loudly, but with a steady calm that drew everyone's attention. His voice was measured, deliberate, and full of quiet authority. He spoke about respect, about the value of family ties and the meaning of honor. He spoke not to chastise, but to illuminate. His words were not accusations, they were truths, gently delivered, that filled the room with their weight. He told them of sacrifices they had never known, of years when my life had been dedicated to providing for the family, quietly and without complaint. He reminded them that respect was not earned in moments of weakness, but in years of devotion and care. His words were not directed at anger, but at understanding. He wanted them to see clearly what had been lost in their laughter and cruelty. As he spoke, I watched my son's face change. The smirk was gone, replaced by a flush of unease. My daughter-in-law's laughter had vanished completely. They listened in silence, their earlier mockery replaced by a deep, uncomfortable stillness. My brother's presence had shifted something in the room. It was as if the air itself had grown heavier with the truth he spoke. He spoke of legacy, not the legacy of wealth or possessions, but of respect, love, and honor. He spoke of what it means to be part of a family and how easily that bond can be broken by thoughtlessness. His words were not loud, but they were powerful. They were the kind of words that settle into a person's mind and refuse to leave. When he finished speaking, there was no applause, no response, just silence. The silence carried more meaning than any argument or reply could. My son's eyes lowered. My daughter-in-law looked away, her earlier confidence replaced by regret. The room was still. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. I did not speak again that day. I did not need to. My brother had said what needed to be said. The lesson was delivered without anger, without insult. It was there in the presence, in the calmness, and in the quiet weight of truth. I knew then that my decision had been right. My lesson would be remembered not for loud words or heated confrontation, but for the quiet authority of truth. That afternoon, as my brother left, I felt a deep sense of peace. I had not lost myself in anger. I had not let cruelty force me to abandon dignity. I had answered with presence, with preparation, and with quiet strength. My son and his wife were left to face their own thoughts. The lesson was theirs to carry forward, and I knew they would. The room was quiet after my brother had spoken, the kind of quiet that is heavier than silence, a quiet filled with the weight of truth, a quiet that made every breath feel slower, deeper, more deliberate. My son's eyes were fixed on the floor, his shoulders tense. My daughter-in-law stared at the wall, her fingers nervously twisting a napkin in her lap. I could feel the shift. The laughter and mockery of earlier had disappeared completely, replaced with uncertainty, shame, and a kind of tension that could not be ignored. I stood there quietly, letting my brother's words sink in. I did not need to speak. My presence was enough. But there was something important to add, something that would cement the lesson. My brother looked toward me, a subtle nod passing between us. It was not just an agreement. It was an understanding that the next moment would be the turning point of this lesson. My brother cleared his throat softly, then turned toward my son and daughter-in-law with a calmness that demanded attention. His voice was steady, but carried an edge that made them listen closely. "You have seen the actions of a father," he began. "You have seen what happens when respect is lost. But respect is not just given, it is earned, and it is preserved through humility, honor, and care. Your laughter today was not laughter of joy, it was laughter of disregard, and disregard is a dangerous thing in family." His words filled the room, not with anger, but with undeniable truth. My son shifted again uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. My daughter-in-law's eyes avoided his face, looking instead toward the floor, as though she were trying to shrink away from something she could not deny. The air felt charged now, charged with the weight of what was being revealed. Then my brother reached into his coat pocket. From there, he pulled something wrapped carefully in cloth. He placed it on the table between us with deliberate care, his hands steady. My son and his wife both glanced toward it with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. My son's eyes narrowed. My daughter-in-law leaned forward slightly, as if sensing something important was about to be said. My brother spoke again, his voice quiet but firm. "These are the truths you have overlooked." He unwrapped the cloth slowly, revealing a collection of old photographs, letters, and a small leather-bound book. The photographs showed years of family gatherings, moments of sacrifice, and simple joys. The letters contained stories written by me and our parents, words of care, wisdom, and the importance of family. The book contained accounts of what my father had built for the family, not as wealth, but as a legacy of love and honor. My son leaned forward, trying to glance at the items on the table. His wife did the same. But there was hesitation in their movement, a hesitation that spoke of guilt they had not yet admitted. My brother did not rush. He let them take in the scene slowly. His calmness made the moment heavier. It was as if every second stretched out, giving them time to absorb the truth he was revealing. Then he began to speak again. These things were built over years of sacrifice. Every piece of respect, every act of love, every lesson of honor is written here. They are not just papers or photographs. They are proof that the foundation of family is not possessions or laughter at another's expense. The foundation is care. The foundation is respect. His words hit harder than I expected. My son's eyes flickered upward to mine, searching perhaps for a defense, an excuse. My daughter-in-law shifted in her seat, her expression unreadable. She glanced at him quietly, and for the first time that afternoon, I saw a shadow of doubt in her smile. The laughter from before was gone. It had been replaced by something heavier, the burden of understanding. I spoke then, quietly but firmly. "You threw away more than my things today. You threw away years of care. But lessons cannot be taken away. They are given freely, whether you accept them or not." My brother nodded at me, and for a moment there was a silent understanding between us. I was not there to fight or yell. I was there to teach, and my brother had come to help. The photographs and letters remained on the table between us, a quiet testament to what had been lost and what could still be recovered. My son shifted in his chair, the weight of the moment pressing upon him. My daughter-in-law's eyes softened, but she did not speak. It was clear that my brother's revelation had shaken them. Then my brother said something that echoed through the room. "Respect is not bought. Respect is lived. And once it is lost, it cannot be recovered without humility. You cannot demand respect. You earn it, moment by moment, by your actions, by your care for those who have given to you." His words were simple, but they carried a power that was undeniable. The room was silent again. My son's face was pale, his shoulders slumped. My daughter-in-law's lips pressed tightly together. They both understood without speaking that something important had been revealed, a truth they could not deny. The laughter, the mockery, the disregard for my years of sacrifice, it was all laid bare in that moment. My brother closed the leather-bound book slowly and looked at my son. "You may not understand now. But one day, you will look back and see this moment as the turning point. Not for anger, not for punishment, but for the truth of what it means to be family." Then he stood quietly, and without another word, he turned and left the room. His departure was calm, but it left a silence that was impossible to break. My son and his wife remained seated, staring at the photographs, the letters, and the book. They were silent, and their silence was heavier than words. I sat quietly too, feeling a deep sense of peace. I had not shouted, I had not demanded apology, but through my brother's presence, through the quiet revelation, the lesson had been delivered. Respect had been restored, not through anger, but through truth. That day, my home changed. The laughter and mockery were gone. In their place was reflection, a quiet but undeniable understanding. My son and his wife did not speak for a long time. They did not need to. The revelation had spoken for itself, and in that quiet, I knew something important: that silence, presence, and truth together can teach more than words ever could. After the silence settled, I stood alone in the quiet of my home. The room was still filled with the faint scent of dust and memory, the remnants of what had been thrown out the window that afternoon. Yet now, it felt different. It was no longer a place of humiliation or laughter. It was a place of reckoning, of lessons learned in a way no words could match. My heart was calm. There was no rage left in me, only a quiet sense of peace that comes from knowing you have given what was needed most. Not punishment, but truth. I walked slowly to the window where the earlier chaos had taken place. Outside, the sun was dipping low, casting warm light over the street. The neighbors had gone quiet now, their whispers fading like echoes. The laughter of my daughter-in-law had long been replaced by an unspoken understanding that lingered in the air. I knew they would speak about this day for years to come, not in anger, but in the form of a lesson carried forward. Respect is something you can only truly give when it is felt deeply. That was what had happened here. Peace is not something that comes from victory over others. It comes from a quiet acceptance of what is, and the knowing that you have acted with integrity. I had not shouted. I had not struck back. I had not tried to humiliate. My answer was simple: bring in my brother, allow truth to stand, and let them see what they had forgotten. The moment had been theirs, to recognize or reject. They had chosen to recognize. That was enough for me. I sat in my chair that evening, looking at the photographs of my family on the wall. Each frame told a story of sacrifice, laughter, hardship, and love. They reminded me that life is more than moments of anger. Life is about the quiet choices we make, the lessons we pass on, and the dignity we preserve. That day, I had chosen dignity. I had chosen peace, and it had changed everything. My son did not come to me that night, nor did my daughter-in-law. They stayed in their rooms, each lost in thought. But I could feel the change. I could feel it in the silence. There was no resentment in their absence, only reflection, and that to me was a sign that the lesson had taken root. Peace, I realized, is a kind of victory far greater than revenge. It is the victory of self-control over impulse, of truth over loudness, and of love over anger. That evening, I knew I had won such a victory. Not because I had silenced them, but because I had spoken in a language they could not ignore, the language of truth and respect. I thought about my brother again, the way he had entered the house quietly, without judgment, without loud words. His presence had been my answer. He had not come to defend me with anger. He had come to show me the power of quietness, of patience, and of letting truth speak. That was the greatest gift I could have given that day, not just to my son and daughter-in-law, but to myself. Later that night, I stepped outside. The air was cool, carrying the scent of grass and earth. The quiet of the neighborhood felt different now. There was no tension, only the stillness that follows truth being faced. I walked slowly down the street, past the neighbors' homes, past the places where laughter and whispers would carry the story. I walked knowing that what had been taught today would outlive my words. Respect had been restored. Peace had been reclaimed. I returned to my home, closing the door gently behind me. I sat once more in my chair, letting the quiet wash over me. My heart was at rest. There was no need for bitterness, no need for resentment. The lesson was given. The truth was known. My peace was complete. As I lay in bed that night, I thought about life, how fragile it is, how easily it can be damaged by disrespect, and how beautifully it can be healed by quiet lessons. I thought about my son and daughter-in-law, and about how this moment would change them, even if they did not realize it yet. True peace comes not from punishment, but from seeing someone recognize their wrong and choose to change. That was my victory. I drifted into sleep with the sound of silence around me. No loud voices, no arguments, only peace. The kind of peace that comes after truth has been spoken and heard without anger. That night, I dreamed of my father. I saw him smiling quietly, as if he knew this moment would come. I felt his presence beside me, telling me that respect is a gift worth protecting, even when it is tested by cruelty. In my dream, he placed his hand on my shoulder and said nothing, but the peace in his silence spoke louder than any words ever could. When I woke, I knew that I would tell this story one day, not to boast of victory, but to share the truth about what matters most: respect, dignity, quiet strength, and the peace that comes when you choose them over anger. That day, I had walked away without raising my voice. I had walked away without holding on to bitterness. I had walked away with something far greater: peace. And I knew, deep in my heart, that peace is a lesson worth giving as much as respect itself. Now, as an old man, I tell this story quietly, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with a calm that comes from years of living, learning, and forgiving. Life has taught me that respect is never demanded. It is earned through patience, through truth, and through living in a way that honors yourself and others. I have learned that the deepest lessons are not shouted in anger, but taught quietly, through action and example. That day, when my son threw my things out of the window and laughed, I learned a lesson about silence, about dignity, and about the kind of strength that does not come from force, but from quiet resolve. When I think back, I realize that the moment was not just about broken possessions or humiliation. It was about the breaking of respect and trust. It was about the moment when a father realized that his own child no longer saw him as a man of value. That hurt deeper than any act of physical violence. But it was also the moment when I understood something even more important, that teaching respect cannot be done with anger, but with a demonstration of it. That is why I chose to bring my brother into the story. His presence was my silent teacher to them. His quiet dignity reminded my son and daughter-in-law of something they had forgotten: that family is built not on possessions or pride, but on respect and love. I have lived many years since that day, and I still recall the sound of that silence. The way the air changed in the room when my brother entered. The way my son's laughter faded into something heavier, regret, perhaps. And the way my daughter-in-law looked away, as if seeing something she could not undo. That silence was louder than any argument I could have made. It was louder than any fight. It was the sound of truth being felt in a place that no words could reach. That is what I carry with me now. The knowledge that silence can speak louder than noise, and that peace is born from understanding, not victory. I have told this story to my friends and neighbors many times since. I tell it not to boast of my actions, but to remind myself of what truly matters. I tell it to remind them that dignity and peace are choices we make every day. That the most powerful lessons are given quietly. That respect cannot be taken by force. It can only be earned and preserved through example. My son learned that lesson, though perhaps not in the way I wished for him. He learned it in the quiet of a moment where pride and anger were replaced by reflection and regret. In my years since, I have come to understand that revenge is not always about hurting the other person. Sometimes it is about teaching them a truth they cannot ignore. That day was my quiet act of revenge, not through punishment, but through the presence of truth. I did not shout. I did not call him out in anger. I showed him, without words, what respect looks like. That is why my peace is complete. Because I did not seek to destroy him. I sought to teach him. And that is a victory worth more than anything else. As I sit now, with my hair silver and my hands lined with age, I realize the lesson I learned goes far beyond my own family. It is a lesson for life. That we must stand firm in our dignity. That we must teach respect not with anger, but with quiet truth. That we must walk away with peace in our hearts, knowing we have done what we could to make others see what they have lost. I have learned that respect is not about being right. It is about living in a way that honors yourself and others. And that is what I have tried to do every day since. When I look back at my son and his wife now, I do not feel bitterness. I feel a deep sadness that they lost a lesson in the noise of their laughter. But I also feel peace, because I know I gave them something greater, the truth. My son will carry it with him, whether he admits it or not. My daughter-in-law will remember it, whether she speaks of it or not, and I will carry it with me, quietly, as the most precious victory of my life. I have learned that life is not about the loud moments, but the quiet ones. The moments when we make a choice to act with integrity rather than impulse. The moments when we decide to walk away with dignity rather than hold on to resentment. That is why I walk quietly now, carrying no bitterness, only peace. The lesson has been taught, the respect restored, and the silence remains. Now, as I share this story, I tell it not for myself, but for others who may one day face betrayal. I tell it so they know that there is another way, a way of quiet strength, of truth, and of peace. That when respect is lost, it can be reclaimed, not with loudness, not with force, but with dignity. And that is a lesson worth giving. The lesson I have learned is simple, yet powerful. That true strength is shown not in the force of words, but in the quietness of action. That revenge is not about destruction, but about teaching. That peace is not found in winning an argument, but in living with integrity. That is what I have carried with me since that day. And that is why my story ends not with anger, but with peace. Final thought. They laughed at me then. They thought it was weakness. But when they saw my brother, they understood something far greater, that respect is priceless. And I, at last, understood something too. Peace is priceless as well. That is why, even now, I walk quietly through life, carrying that lesson in my heart and sharing it with those who will listen.